They said it was a nuisance. That's the word they chose when they put their complaint in writing, folded it into a stiff white envelope and slid it under my door. The envelope was stamped with the cold letters of the Homeowners Association. But what it really carried was not just a complaint about bees. It carried a judgment. It carried an accusation. It carried the weight of centuries of being told that what we build, what we nurture, what we own, somehow doesn't belong in the places we live. For me, those bees were not just insects. They were life. They were history. They were my father's hands teaching me patience in the heat of a Mississippi summer, pointing to a hive and saying, "Son, you see how they work together? You see how they don't ask permission, don't apologize, don't stop. That's how we survive." My father was a man who understood that dignity wasn't given freely. It was taken, cultivated, protected like honey in a comb. He passed down that lesson, and with it the hives. When I moved into this neighborhood, I didn't come seeking conflict. I came with quiet intentions. I wanted a place where my children could ride their bikes down a street line with magnolia trees, where my wife could plant a garden and tend it without the noise of the city pressing in. I wanted what so many of us want, peace. But peace for us always seems conditional. The HOA said the bees were dangerous. They said neighbors complained of stings, of swarms hovering too close to their backyards. But I knew better. My bees were docile, Italian honeybees, bred for calmness and productivity. I had trained them, cared for them, respected them. And in return, they had given me not just honey, but something bigger. They gave me partnership. They gave me a livelihood. What the HOA didn't know, or perhaps didn't care to know, was that the honey from my hives didn't just sit on my kitchen shelf. It traveled, it moved. It found its way into farmers' markets, into local stores, into schools where children tasted something pure for the first time. It supplied churches that used it in communion bread, health clinics that gave it to soothe coughs, community kitchens that drizzled it over cornbread baked in iron skillets. My honey wasn't just a product, it was a contribution, a thread in the fabric of my community. But when they slid that envelope under my door, they weren't asking me to remove a nuisance. They were asking me to erase a piece of myself. They were asking me to choose between the comfort of silence and the dignity of standing tall. I remember holding the letter in my hand, my fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of déjà vu. I thought about my grandfather, a man who kept bees long before anyone saw value in it, a man who was told his land wasn't worth much, that his work wasn't valuable, that his life could be measured by somebody else's standards. And I thought, not this time, not again. That night I walked out to the hives. The air was heavy, still humming with the day's warmth. The bees moved in their steady rhythm, wings flickering in the low light, thousands of tiny bodies working together in harmony. I placed my hand on the wooden box and whispered to them the way my father used to. "We're going to be all right." The next HOA meeting was a spectacle. I walked in with my head high, though I could feel the eyes on me, some curious, some cold, some already made up. They spoke first, reading off their list of complaints. Safety hazard, they said. Unreasonable, they said. Violation of community standards. Each word was like a gavel, an attempt to crush me under a weight of rules, written by people who never understood what it meant to fight for the right to simply be. And when they finished, they looked at me, waiting for an apology, waiting for me to bow. But I didn't. I cleared my throat and told them the story. I told them about my father's hands, about the bees that fed our family when jobs were scarce, about how honey paid for school books and medicine. I told them about how I built something not just for myself, but for my neighbors, for the state, for anyone who believed in the taste of something real. You call them a nuisance, I said, but these bees are life givers. They pollinate your flowers, they sweeten your tea, they keep alive a tradition older than this neighborhood itself. You call them a violation. I call them survival. The room was quiet. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some avoided my gaze. But I could see that my words had landed somewhere deeper than they expected. Still, I knew words alone might not be enough. HOA boards are made of rules, and rules are their armor. But history has taught us something. Rules can be challenged. Laws can be changed. Silence can be broken. When I left that meeting, I didn't feel defeated. I felt fueled, because I understood that this wasn't just about bees, it was about dignity. About the right to exist fully, without apology, in spaces that too often try to erase us. That weekend, I invited neighbors to my home. I opened the backyard gate and let them see the hives up close. I showed them how the bees moved calmly, how they landed gently on flowers, how they weren't the threat the HOA painted them to be. I handed out jars of golden honey, thick and shining in the light. Children dipped spoons and their eyes widened with delight. Mothers asked for recipes. Fathers asked about the process. Elders nodded with understanding. And slowly I began to see what I had always known. Truth, when shared, has power. When people see the work, when they taste the fruit of it, when they feel the story in their own hands, it changes things. But I also knew that change never comes easy. That letter under my door was just the beginning. The following weeks turned into a test of patience and principle. The HOA escalated, sending more notices, each one colder than the last. They cited rules about livestock, noise, safety, anything they could stretch, to cover their fear of something they never tried to understand. They threatened fines. They threatened legal action. They wanted me gone or my bees gone, but I had already made up my mind. I wasn't about to fold under their pressure. I wasn't just standing for myself. I was standing for every black man who had been told his labor was too loud, his presence too disruptive, his contributions too small to matter. I was standing for my grandfather who worked land he didn't own, for my father who taught me to respect the smallest of creatures, for my children who deserved to grow up watching their father refuse to shrink. I filed my own paperwork. This time not with the HOA, but with the State Agricultural Office. I presented documentation, proof of my apiary license, proof of compliance with environmental standards, proof that my honey was being sold statewide to markets, restaurants, and health cooperatives. I wasn't just a hobbyist beekeeper. I was a registered supplier. My bees weren't backyard clutter. They were part of the food chain of an entire state. And when the HOA tried to push me into a corner, I pushed back with facts and law. I reminded them that agriculture, no matter how small, was protected by state rights that superseded HOA regulations. I reminded them that bees were recognized as essential pollinators by environmental protection acts. I reminded them that their paperwork might be neat, but my history was deeper. My bees weren't just mine. They belonged to a legacy of black farmers, growers, and workers who fed this nation without ever being given proper credit. Still, they resisted. They called an emergency meeting. I showed up, not with anger, but with calm, with dignity. I brought jars of honey, labeled with the names of the very stores and institutions they shopped at. I laid them out on the table like evidence. This honey you see here, I told them, has traveled farther than any of us sitting in this room. It feeds your families whether you realize it or not. When you call my bees a nuisance, you are dismissing the work that puts food on your table. Some of them looked away, others leaned in, their defenses softening. It's hard to argue with truth when it's laid bare before you, glowing golden in the light. But it wasn't until the local news picked up the story that the tide shifted. A neighbor, one of the mothers who had visited my hives with her children, shared her experience online. She talked about the beauty of seeing the bees up close, about the taste of the honey, about how I was being unfairly targeted. The post went viral in our community. Soon local reporters were at my door. They wanted to see the hives, hear the story, taste the honey. And once the story spread, it became something larger than me. I started receiving letters from other black beekeepers across the country, telling me about their struggles, about the obstacles they faced trying to keep alive a practice that had been in our culture for generations. They told me about discrimination, about zoning fights, about neighbors who looked at their hives as threats instead of blessings. My fight was their fight. My story was their story. The HOA could not silence that. Eventually, the board backed down. They realized the weight of public opinion, the strength of the law, and the resilience of my spirit. They rescinded their threats quietly, like bullies retreating when the crowd finally sees what they are. No apology was given, of course, but I didn't need one. Their silence was its own kind of surrender. But the victory was not just in keeping my bees. The victory was in proving that our contributions cannot be erased, that what we build with our hands, our patience, and our sweat carries value beyond the narrow definitions of those who fear us. When I look at my hives now, I see more than just bees. I see a symbol of resistance, of survival, of sweetness pulled out of struggle. Every drop of honey is a reminder that we have always turned the smallest things into sustenance, that we have always found ways to thrive even when the world tried to box us in. My children stand beside me sometimes, watching as I lift the frames heavy with honeycomb. They ask questions. They point to the bees. And I tell them the same thing my father told me. You see how they work together? You see how they never stop? That's how we survive. The HOA tried to strip me of dignity, but instead they handed me a platform. They forced me to tell my story, and in doing so, reminded me of the power of our stories to connect, to inspire, to protect us. This isn't just about bees. It never was. It's about the right to claim space, the right to create, the right to exist without apology. It's about black pride, about legacy, about dignity carved from wood, wax, and wings. It's about honey that runs thicker than prejudice, sweeter than hate. And so I continue. I tend my hives. I bottle the honey. I deliver it across the state, each jar carrying not just flavor but history. And when I see it on the shelves of stores, in the hands of neighbors, in the meals of strangers, I know the truth. They tried to call my bees a nuisance, but in reality, they are lifelines. They are symbols of a sweetness that cannot be silenced. The fight with the HOA was just one chapter. The story of my bees and the story of us is far from over.